Are financial regulation and supervision able to keep pace with the impact of fintech on the financial sector? Looking in particular at the cases of innovation facilitators and crypto assets, we discussed this question with Elisabeth Noble, Senior Policy Expert at the European Banking Authority. This podcast was recorded in November 2019 in Florence, Italy, during the Autumn School on FinTech at the European University Institute's Florence School of Banking and Finance. Elisabeth Noble, thank you very much for being here with us in Florence for this course on FinTech and the regulation of FinTech. At the EBA, you lead the authority's work on crypto assets and innovation facilitators. And the first question for this podcast tackles financial regulation. So in your opinion, is financial regulation able to keep pace with the new innovations?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the course, which I think is very timely, bearing in mind FinTech developments that we're seeing across the financial sector. In terms of your question, I think I would actually frame it slightly differently, not only by reference to regulation, but also supervision. Because for us, I think we need to look very hard at our regulatory systems, but also our supervisory systems to make sure that they're fit for purpose as we see FinTech continuing to impact the financial sector. But whether we can keep pace or not, I think depends on, firstly, if we have a sufficient monitoring framework to really follow the trends as they occur. The second, to continue to monitor things like the regulatory perimeter to make sure that it's fit for purpose. And then finally, to look at our supervisory knowledge, our supervisory culture, and make sure that that's also fit for purpose, taking account of technology development.
Now, innovation facilitators have the potential to bridge industry, regulation, and supervision. So could you elaborate more on what these schemes are?
Yes, I think in terms of this question about whether we can keep pace with innovation, one of the really nice tools that we've seen emerge over the last couple of years is this notion of innovation facilitator, which tend to take two forms. Firstly, regulatory sandboxes, and secondly, innovation hubs. And as you say, these very nicely bridge industry and supervisors on fintech-related issues, but they do so in quite different ways. So starting with the innovation hubs, these are schemes typically set up by competent authorities that provide an interface for firms to raise questions about whether an activity involving an innovative technology might involve a regulated financial service, and if so, would it require a license or a registration arrangement? But more generally, to ask questions about supervisory expectations around the use of a technology in a specific use case. And we have them now almost in every jurisdiction, and they've proved very successful in just providing this contact point for industry to raise these questions with supervisors on effectively a real-time basis. So they're really helpful for both the industry to give this almost real-time answer to questions as the innovation is actually happening on the ground, but also for supervisors to follow better innovative developments. Turning to the sandboxes, we have these in far fewer member states currently, although they continue to grow in number. And these are schemes that allow for testing of an innovative proposition within a very tightly controlled framework that gives the supervisor a close proximity to the test, so that both the private sector participant and the supervisor can learn together about how a technology might be used in the financial sector and what this might mean in terms of potentially updating or revising, etc., the regulatory framework to ensure that the appropriate checks and balances are in place. So these sandboxes we've seen being used for things like DLT trials, AI trials, actually pretty much across the full range of technology use cases, but they are proving to be quite successful as well in just this bridging the gap so that industry and supervisors have a much closer dialogue on innovation-related issues. So I think from our perspective, both are very good in rising to the challenge of keeping pace with industry on innovation.
And taking into account one of the innovations that you were mentioning at the beginning, and in particular crypto assets, what are the primary regulatory challenges with relation to crypto assets?
We see crypto assets raising challenges across the full range of regulatory objectives that we're used to dealing with. So these are things like consumer protection, financial integrity, and potentially ultimately financial stability. So just looking at a few of those in turn, with, for instance, consumer protection, the experience so far in the crypto asset space has been not necessarily particularly positive because, of course, for things like the Bitcoin, we've seen very high volatility of prices, and some retail investors may not have been necessarily aware of that volatility when they entered into investments of that nature. With things like initial coin offerings, we've also had a few negative experiences where some investors have lost out because of fraudulent ICO practices. So here we need to be very mindful of the need to ensure that consumers are sufficiently well informed about opportunities and risks presented by crypto asset products, and to ensure that appropriate disclosure mechanisms are in place. Looking at things like financial integrity, of course we know that crypto assets can be a means to transmit value through the system without using a traditionally regulated financial institution. And of course there are some people who may seek to use that system for, let's say, not entirely legitimate purposes. So ensuring that we maintain system integrity is very important, which for instance involves us extending AML requirements to things like virtual asset exchanges and wallet providers, which is something we've done under AMLD5. And then of course now we're starting to talk about things like global stablecoins, where these are still crypto assets but with the potential to scale potentially quite quickly because of the nature of the issuer. And here we need to think about a much broader set of issues around operational resilience of these systems, and also some wider policy questions for things like monetary policy and of course ultimately financial stability. So with crypto assets there are actually a range of different issues we need to be thinking about and working together as a cross-jurisdictional and cross-sectoral community to make sure that we come up with a response that is appropriate and works regardless of the context in which the crypto asset may be used.
In your opinion, what will be the future trends that we can observe in terms of evolution of fintech, both in the EU and beyond?
I think we see three main trends in terms of how fintech is impacting the financial services sector. The first is very much a product delivery point where we don't necessarily see any new services or activities emerging, but we are seeing fintech impact the way these services are being delivered. So for instance, we've seen this with things like mobile banking applications and so on, where the product is still the same, for instance, access to your deposit account, but the way you're gaining access is not through a conventional bank branch, but it's instead through a digital access point. So that's the first message. It's really impacting the way financial services are being delivered. The second is a macro point, in that fintech is impacting the structure of the financial system, where we're seeing both incumbents and new entrants leverage technology to position themselves in the market in different ways. We're also seeing potentially a future trend towards reaggregation of financial services onto single digital platforms, which again marks quite a change to what we've seen in the past, where we've traditionally seen disintermediation rather than reaggregation of financial services. The final point is that we are seeing some new products and services emerge, predominantly in the crypto asset space and also in the context of crowdfunding. But for the most part, I'd say that's the more limited trend, whereas the delivery mechanism point and the structure point are the main ways in which fintech is currently impacting the financial services market.
Thank you for having listened to this podcast by the Florence School of Banking and Finance. For more information and to listen to all our podcasts, visit the webpage fbf.ui.eu/podcasts.